Come with me and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look and you'll see into your imagination.
So the race is on. 5 golden tickets are sent out for allowing kids to visit a chocolate factory that has a mysterious creator, hasn't been seen for years. That's basically the story, of course, of Willie Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, remade more recently in 2005 with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm again John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there, I'm just in keeping in spirit. I'm actually finishing eating some chocolate.
Yeah, I was going to say too that like after watching these, I've eaten more chocolate than I have probably in the past few months and stuff. So it's funny how that, and we'll definitely get more into that as well about how movies like this can really boost candy sales, no doubt. I thought that to kind of start off this week's discussion was the idea of how movies and for that matter, we've talked about it in different ways, but music can be such an important part of the storytelling. And I feel like these are definitely, 2 good examples that show at least the importance of it. And I thought we'd kind of kick things off with like kind of just basically talking about, different ways that music, can really make or break a movie.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I'm very much into music anyway, but I really feel like, it really sets the tone, the atmosphere. And I think there's a good reason why John Carpenter did all of the music in his movies,
right?
Because it can completely transform a movie. I mean, what would the Pink Panther be without Henry Mancini? What would Star Wars be without John Williams?
I was going to say,
it's just, that really is absolutely key to setting the mood. And I think in a way that something that's actually been lost by movies, I would say in the last 10, maybe more years, is this idea of themes for particular characters.
Yes.
Like there's very few movies now that have actual themes for characters. I mean, you just know Indiana Jones, Star Wars, and Superman. They instantly from the themes. I mean, even Flash Gordon, every movie I can think of that was like that had something where you just knew there were what was coming as soon as you heard that tune. And everything is just, I mean, it's being engineered to manipulate emotions in different scenes. They've kind of really keyed in on that. But what's been lost is, it's really the musical soul, I would say, of movie soundtracks. It's far too it's just kind of faded into the background, which is a shame, really.
Yeah, you gave a great example too of with Star Wars. That was like one of the first albums that I bought, and I can remember that. Of course, this was a time when, until the next Star Wars movie came along, listening to the music, you pictured the movie happening in your head and stuff, because other than the next time that like they had a it was in the theaters and you can kind of, watch it again, stuff like that. There was really no other way, and then, you had your maybe like your little Viewmaster and kind of you're clicking through and like kind of, the few frames of the movie and stuff, there was no downloading. There was no like kind of, DVD and, what's it called? So absolutely. And we'll definitely, like in an upcoming episode, we'll be kind of talking about Hidden Fortress versus Star Wars and stuff. And, like kind of referencing, the I guess in some ways the unofficial remake of The Force Awakens and everything. And I think you really see, like you said, that diluting of the effect of where, when you had Leia's theme, that was Leia and stuff. And then, in subsequent movies, it became like, this time that like they wanted to kind of have like you said, a emotional scene was like kind of, like they'll kind of basically cut and paste Leia's music and stuff into that.
Well, the clever thing about it is, right, and this is what most people don't realize, and this is the one thing that bugs me about modern movies, is that they haven't realized that this is a key part of getting you to empathize with the character. I mean, storytelling, the key part of storytelling is to empathize. That's your main role as the audience member. And by creating a tune that people can latch onto, you immediately put yourself in the position of that character at that moment in the story. So yeah, I mean, and I think actually at the end of the 80s, really, you can kind of see the end of, character themes. And the interesting twist on that is, again, Tarantino kind of did his whole remix of this by what he did was, rather than giving, I mean, I guess this may have been, again, a sort of a budgetary constraint or something like this, but, Reservoir Dogs created this thing where he picked out songs from a particular period and tied them to scenes or characters. So that, like, what song, I can't remember the name of the song, but if you played me the song where, John Travolta and Uma Thurman are dancing, everyone knows that is the scene from Pulp Fiction. So he did it in a slightly different way. But he's the only other director or filmmaker that I can think of that has used music in such a kind of creative and distinctive way since those classic kind of themes of people. Yeah.
And, so of course, that's a good segue into the first movie with, Gene Wilder and stuff, because now when we hear, like, pure imagination, I mean, it's, it's like you just right away, the image of Gene Wilder comes up and stuff. And of course, like, kind of, Willy Wonka. I mean, that's just as much, like, kind of the connection to the character, like you said, and also, like, kind of the feelings that, like, we have, even though, like, maybe we're not in the shoes of Gene Wilder per se, but with the, at least, with Charlie and how he's basically, like, kind of, evokes that kind of wonder that he has of, like, kind of being this, magical factory and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's really lost, like, kind of by, like, in the way that it's handled in the, nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, I would say pure imagination, obviously the Oompa Loompa songs, and I've Got a Golden Ticket, those are just such memorable songs.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's any others. There aren't really.
Candyman.
The Candyman, yeah, which is, yeah. So 4 very, very memorable pieces of music that are really better than, they're almost up there with Sound of Music and Wizard of Oz and Mary Poppins in terms of catchy tunes in kids' movies. So they definitely are very iconic. And what's interesting for me is that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is written with music in it. In that, the Oompa Loompas, actually, their songs are written out, and it's up to you as the parent to try and improvise a song over the top, which is a lot more difficult. I should state as well that I've recently just reread both Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and The Grey Class Elevator to my daughter, so I've been through this, and they're long songs as well. Yeah, it was there like, God, man, I'm trying to. There's like an entire page of stuff, and I'm trying to get the beats and the scanning of the songs right. But they have this. It is a component of the story, and whilst the remake is more faithful, I kind of feel that the songs in the original, they actually capture the spirit of those particular scenes. Like this idea that you can go into sort of a scene of nature and everything is there, you can eat. I mean, even like these days with all of our wondrous iPad apps and everything, that idea really captured my daughter's imagination completely. This idea that you could eat anything around you is really, it's really amazing, and completely summed up in that song as well.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like, we're definitely going to be biased. I feel like kind of towards the original and stuff in this case. Ironically, though, that like Roald Dahl actually said that, like, Gene Wilder was, like kind of, he really disliked, the choice and stuff. And that's really kind of interesting because, here we have the writer, right? And then he had a totally different picture of, like kind of who, Willy Wonka was. And meanwhile, though, for us as the audience, we just now can't even imagine anybody else, like kind of, and then which, we're definitely going to get into with remake and stuff. And yeah, I mean, and one thing I did notice on this rewatching though was, like Gene Wilder has this kind of subtlety to the humor that, like,
Yeah.
You know, it's just from the opening kind of thing where he's first walking and he's, you know, kind of like hobbling along and stuff, and you know, doing the stumbling and everything. It's you know, he's specifically, that was his choice as an actor. That's not something from the book, you know, and you know, it wasn't in the script and everything like that. And he basically said that that's going to be his introduction to everybody. And he said to the director, "Hey, if you you know, don't do this, I'm out of the movie." I mean, you know, that was a pretty bold move. I mean,
Wow.
you know, because here's somebody who's like, yeah, he kind of had a couple of roles and stuff, but he was by no means a star at that point. And in fact, you know, like ultimately, what's funny though was that this actually was the third bomb for Gene Wilder though. Like he, you know, like before that was the producers, and so he hadn't hit his stride yet and everything. But at the same time, he felt that strong conviction towards that artistic choice though, that he said, you know, if we don't do this, you know, I'm out.
It's a good instinct though, because it's very effective in that.
Oh
scene.
yeah.
I mean, it really is. It's a really great way of opening and setting the scene for that character as someone who's just sort of has this sort of weird nihilistic sort of desire to trick people for no particularly good reason.
Right.
But that is kind of keeping with the character in the book. I mean, in the book, he seems like he's certainly is very indifferent to most of the other children. And I think what's interesting is that in the book, Charlie is kind of just left over after they get rid of the other kids as the one who's like the only one. And he kind of does say more explicitly at the end of the book that, you know, oh, I'm so glad that you were the one that won. I feel like you deserved it. And whereas and kind of Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka does that as well. But Johnny Depp as Willy Wonka doesn't do that at all. He's even more, he carries that kind of indifference much more strongly in the character than Gene Wilder does.
Right.
But I mean, this kind of, there is this in, you know, yeah, he just doesn't really seem to care very much about the kids that get sort of turned into blueberries and everything else in the book. So I think he kind of carried that over into the character. And it was weird. I thought that Roald Dahl's criticism was that he felt the film focused too much on Willy Wonka. But I mean, Willy Wonka, in the grand scheme of things, as a character, is pretty amazing. He's got, you know, he seems to be able to bend the laws of physics. He's a complete, he's kind of like eccentric, and he runs this mad sort of chocolate factory which no one goes on. He's quite obviously the person you have to focus on in the movie. You know, I mean, it's
right.
Yeah.
And for me, like, you know, the humor that I missed, you know, like kind of watching it when I was younger or something like that, was things like where, you know, the kids be doing their thing and stuff like that, and Gene Wilder kind of goes, "Oh no, don't do that!" Like kind of, you know, like very like passively and stuff.
Stop! Don't do that.
Right. And you don't realize like kind of, you know, what he's doing there as a kid, but then now as an adult, you kind of go, "Oh, he's really like kind of just already written these kids off and stuff."
Well, I mean, I think really ultimately, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is about parenting, right? And so how many times as a parent do you kind of had to say to your kids, "No, stop, don't do that. I've told you this a million times," and you get pissed off because they never listen to you, even though you're telling them. You don't necessarily want to have to tell them to do this, but you know, and that's the same thing that sort of frustrates Willy Wonka, is that he's telling people, "No, don't go and slurp the chocolate out of the river." And in the Great Glass Elevator, that's more explicitly kind of stated in that there are these pills that make you old, that make you younger, and then make you older, and all the lovable old sort of grandmas and grandpas from the first movie all start trying to sort of hog all the pills that make you younger. So even these characters that you kind of identified with and felt quite sorry for in the first one, he kind of flips it a little bit and makes you kind of see they're almost like the kids of the first book. And so, and again, it says, you know, there's a bit where it says Willy Wonka kind of gave them the pills and said, you know, just take one or two. And then he went over and sat by the chocolate river and kind of just stayed silent because he could hear them squabbling. And it says, you know, he couldn't stand people who didn't do what he asked and were just fighting over things that he says when it comes to the most important things people can't be trusted to do the sensible thing, basically. That's the kind of point of his character.
It's funny how, like, he, Roald Dahl wrote this for kids, right, and stuff, but he definitely understood that it would more likely be the parents reading them to the kids. And yet, like, the adults in the book are, like, they're pretty much very, ineffective parents. For that matter, just pretty stupid. I mean, at least the way that they're, like, adults are just really portrayed as kind of like, I guess, in some ways, the source of, like, kind of, like where the kids are, like, the next generation of dumb, I guess, so to speak.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think they're almost like expressions of biblical, the 7 deadly sins,
yes,
in a way.
I was going to say.
You've got greed, I guess. Veruca's salt is kind of like envy, maybe, in that she wants everything that everyone else has. And,
right.
And
gluttony
must
with
have it. Yeah,
Augustus.
Augustus. I don't know what you would have as Veruca. I mean, as Violet Beauregard, because she's sort of compulsion, really. I guess is or obsessiveness. I guess.
Well, a bit of vanity.
Vanity, yeah,
and maybe lust and stuff in some ways, and
and then Mike TV. I guess what would it be?
Wrath and sloth, like, kind of, because he's just sitting in front of the TV all the time.
You're right. Hey, you're up on your biblical 7 deadly sins there, John. I'm impressed.
Well, what about Charlie though? Like, because in theory he's also, like, kind of, like, he's not just purely good, right? Because he and the grandfather, violated the thing of, like, not, like, he was told not to touch, like, kind of the stuff or whatever, and then
fizzy lifting drinks.
But
of course that's not in the book though. They added that specifically for the movie. Yeah.
Okay.
No, he doesn't steal any of the drinks in the book. He just they keep him clean in that one. And I think in a way that was a way of I mean, it's kind of a funny scene. I mean, my daughter got a kick out of watching these weird sort of 70s characters burping in a tower. But I think also it just adds that extra layer of unexpected behavior from Willie Wonka at the end.
Right.
I mean, I also really like the legal document that he makes them sign.
Yeah, I was going to say that was another thing that, like, I was surprised that they didn't copy that in the remake.
Yeah, but it's not in the book either. That's definitely individual to the movie. There's quite a few things that I mean, the hands when they give them their hats and coats. That's an invention of the movie. They had to change out the squirrels with the bit where Veruca Salt wants one of the squirrels in the book anyway, and in the remake. Obviously, effects wise, it would have been easier. It's easier to have, like, a few ducks and go and sit on a scale rather than. So I think that was a budgetary change, or just a technical change.
It also made it great for the kind of the good bad egg, kind of
totally
skill.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of similar proverb, I guess, or is it proverb?
Right.
Well, it's like well-known saying. So,
right.
Yeah, but yeah, the whole Slugworth character is a complete departure.
Okay.
This idea that he's, they're actively trying to betray Willy Wonka for cash is definitely an invention of the 70s version. And then this whole thing at the end, the test, kind of weird, and that's probably why it kind of feels like Willy Wonka's just being a bit of a dick at the end. That's kind of like the impression you get, right? But I kind of like Gene Wilder pulls it off, and it's one of those scenes that really sticks with you, because you just think, why is he so angry, and then why is he so elated? It's very kind of really plays up that kind of schizophrenic version of the character.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that, I think Gene Wilder does well, is, like, kind of, portraying things like kind of, where, in fact, he was apparently, saw himself more as a serious actor until, finally when he started kind of really just accepting that, he's a comedic actor. I mean, like, in other words, he knew he was good at it, but he was, like, kind of tried to make himself, like, or he was a student of the Stanislavski method and stuff like that. And so he was, like, very much trying to push himself in that direction. But, I think that's why we kind of see this tension with him. But at the same time, I think what's funny is that, like, that became also the source of his comedy as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he's so effective in that he adds that complete conviction to some of those
Hmm.
scenes, but he can, and I would say, compared to a lot of his other roles, he plays it fairly comedically and still brings definitely some different sort of range and emotion, but it doesn't get as dark as it does in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There's a real edge and like a tension to his performance in that. You really feel like in those, there's only a few moments, but you really feel like, he's really lost his mind, which is great, you know.
And it kind of brings in the element that we've talked about before, that like sometimes for all the different movies, regardless of genre, having a horror element really heightens things. And I feel like
Totally.
this is a great example of how, like, you have a children's story and a fantasy for that matter, but it's the darkness that really like kind of cranks things up, where you kind of like different times feel like you don't know what to expect, as you turn the corner and stuff. And it just really heightens the emotion, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, no scene can better express that than when they're on the boat and, there's the chicken's head being chopped off in the background. But that it's kind of described in a similar way in the book, in that it does sort of like, there's this kind of crescendo of the text as well, as things get faster and faster, and then all of a sudden it's like
Right.
stop. So I think they really accurately portrayed that, more so than the remake, where that whole scene doesn't have anywhere near like the kind of the tension and the drama of the 70s one. But yeah, it's interesting, as you're saying, this kind of unpredictable and darkness that he brings to the character is kind of in keeping, I think, with the character in the book. It's
Okay.
kind of it, even though they've changed a lot of those scenes from the book, I think it does keep with the character. I don't think Willy Wonka is a particularly cheery character. So I think that's quite effective. But I think in a way as well, this kind of represents being a parent as well in Willy Wonka, because there are times when you do things where you might seem like incredibly angry and then incredibly nice very quickly in very quick succession, and it may not necessarily make sense, but it's kind of like Charlie has to just kind of accept that this whole sort of crazy ride will ultimately be beneficial to him in some form. And I kind of think that's quite an interesting kind of analogy for parenting in a way, or the experience of being a parent, I would say.
Right. And I think it's funny how, the idea that like, here's somebody who like, we see like, not as even as extreme the poverty, I think, as we'll see in the remake and stuff. But, they're basically down to their last dollars and stuff. And what's interesting also in this version, there's no dad. Like I forgot about that, and so he's like, the more or less the second source of income, because the mother apparently does laundry, I guess, to kind of keep the family somewhat afloat.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, there's a good 4 chapters dedicated to describing how poor they are and how malnourished Charlie is. They describe him as being, thinner and shorter than all the other kids in school. I mean, God, by the time he's opened that 3rd bar of chocolate, you're like, oh God, for God's sake, please let him find a golden ticket before he dies. I mean, it's really, it's horrendous, the book, in that respect. But in this one, they've taken a kind of a shortcut in that, well, we'll just kill his dad off. We'll make you feel sorry for him that way. It's a much quicker mechanism to use in a movie. So yeah. But but not that his dad plays any particularly interesting role.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's also funny that, where it's a sign of the time, so to speak, because, like one of the last dollars that he's got left, he's like kind of encouraging his grandfather to like use it for his smokes and stuff, like kind of, and something that like you just would never hear about nowadays, I think. And so it's funny how like that was like one of the things, like, oh, grandpa, kind of, you got to have your smokes. It's like, what?
Yeah, there's a few. And of course, it's not a terribly ethnically diverse group of children they let into the chocolate factory in this one.
And the one that like would have been the ethnic choice, so to speak, was apparently like the scam and stuff, right? That basically forged the golden ticket.
Yeah, right.
So that's
yeah. That's very much a Yeah, product of Roald Dahl, sort of English person in the 70s outlook on the world, I guess.
Well, apparently too, like, and you'll probably know better than me, like that the Oompa Loompas, at least in the books, are supposed to be pretty racially non-PC. Like where they're basically like they're kind of like Aborigines or something like that, and whereas in the movie they're kind of given this orange skin, so they're more like very much like fantasy creatures and stuff. But apparently that wasn't the case in the book.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, they're very short. They're almost so short that you can't really identify them as people exactly, because they're only like about 2 feet high or something.
Right.
Like this. So they kind of, they did their own version of it in the 70s. And I think by painting them orange, I think in a way that was their way of trying to kind of distance them from any kind of known ethnicity.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know.
It's kind of ironic that, of course, here in the States, that's become the thing of with the current president and stuff. He's kind of referred to. He's referred to as a Oompa Loompa.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess in a way it is like where maybe it's not as racial, but then it apparently has now political connotations.
Political connotations, yeah. Well, they're all kind of, if you look at it, the Oompa Loompas, they're authoritarian rule. They all follow one guy.
Right.
They're very against. They're like for traditional parenting values.
That's true.
So it's yeah.
And
Trumpers.
And the music though, like we've talked about already, and like the Oompa Loompa song, it's kind of like, I feel like what's really effective about it is that like when you hear it coming on, you kind of know what you're going to expect and stuff like that, and like kind of where it's basically like kind of has this oompa, like kind of that rhythm and like kind of, and we kind of know like that it's basically tying like kind of what just happened and stuff with the kids and everything to like kind of like you said, the lesson that they're going to basically instill upon us in that moment and stuff.
Yeah, and they pull no punches in when it comes to spoiling children.
No.
They're just like, oh, it's all the parents' fault. That's all. It's not a particularly popular outlook on parenting, I would say, these days. It's kind of there's almost this thing of you've got to let your kids express themselves and all this kind of thing, and this idea that kids have different characteristics that they're born with, and they don't necessarily, it's not all nurture. So they don't basically, like the modern psychological approach is not for the parents to take it all on themselves, because it'll probably make them more miserable and a worse parent maybe at the end of the day.
But that's definitely a more traditional approach. It's like, that it's about accountability though, like, because that's the thing that you see over and over again with each of their songs and kind of, the overall thing is like, where it's like, okay, if the kids screw up, like kind of, like kind of they're paying the price, and, the parents are the ones that are responsible for the fact that like, the kids screwed up and stuff. And so it's kind of like accountability, a chain and stuff.
Totally, yeah. I mean, it's all about taking responsibility, effectively. And I think that's why also, Willy Wonka does these various choices. Is that it's like, can you be trusted to take responsibility for your own actions in a sensible way? It's a lot of the sort of situations he puts those kids in, both this and The Great Glass Elevator. But
yeah, I mean, that's, ultimately, I think we see that in Charlie, though, that like, like he's not without flaws and stuff, but yet his heart's in the right place and stuff, whereas, he's, willing to kind of, sacrifice the last dollar, the last bite of chocolate for that matter too and stuff. And that's something that like we don't see in any of the other kids. Kind of, like for them, it's like that not only, are they going to get the first bite and stuff, but also like, and the last bite, kind of where like, in other times blaming the parents if like they're not getting any of that too. So it's like it's almost in a way maybe foreshadowing like kind of kids and the lack of accountability nowadays and stuff. And that like in other words, like that's what is being portrayed as like, okay, these are the problems that are going to be happening and stuff. And there's some truth to it. Like kind of, that like, in other words, there's probably a lot of the problems that we have with, kids nowadays is the fact that like, there's a real kind of like, it's more convenient and the tendency is to kind of blame that like, oh, it's society, or, oh, it's video games, or, oh, it's, the media, kind of, and watching shows that like kind of, damage the kids and stuff like that, like, oh, it's not the kids and it's not the parenting, it's all everything else going on in the world.
Well, you sort of see that in some of the sort of protests in universities. It's like, they're saying, they're giving this argument like, this university is supposed to be a safe space, and
right.
and you're sort of treading on my rights here. And it's like, well, you can look at it that way, or you can just look at it like it's your right to make your own mind up and just have a sort of a rational thought, have a rational sort of series of ideas about something. You shouldn't necessarily project the idea that a university is some sort of parental kind of thing that's there to sort of coddle you and protect you. It's just an institution, and I would say probably a financially motivated institution if modern academia is anything to go by. But I think definitely with Charlie, you see that in fact, in a way, it's written in a way that a lot of the older adult characters aren't particularly responsible, I would say.
Right.
Most of the old grandparents have just lied in bed for the last 20 years, and they're supposed to be in their 80s. So admittedly, you can say, okay, they must have retired, but they obviously didn't do much. They weren't real kind of entrepreneurs going out there and saving a fortune for their families. Likewise, poor Mr. Bucket is there as a toothpaste cap screwer honor. And if Charlie's anything to go by, and his wife, he's obviously not a complete idiot. So you do wonder, like, at what point in his life do you decide that you shouldn't be a toothpaste cap screwer honor and done something a bit more interesting with your life? But it's almost, again, I would say that's almost like a failure of the adults, in that they're fairly useless, most of the adults in Charlie's life, and he's the one with the paper round, and he's sacrificing his food and stuff to make sure they're okay. So he's very much like the responsible one in that family, I would say.
Yeah, one part that I forgot in the original was the science teacher, and so we kind of see a little bit of the how bright Charlie is and stuff, and then and meanwhile though, it's what it reflects on is like, not, of course, obviously not too well on the education system, but also how this idea that like, okay, here you may have a bright mind, but what happens when like the minds that are teaching them aren't so bright themselves? Again, I mean, that's a really scary question to ask, really.
Well, I mean, I think and this is something I would say the 70s version picks up on. This may be a result of kind of like economic sort of downturn at that time, because we know, certainly in the States, England, the 70s was not a particularly affluent time for most people.
Right.
And I think they're almost saying, in a way, you've got to have your golden ticket to make sure you're going to be all right in life. It's like, it's very much like factory owners versus someone who, even though they're intelligent and they're responsible, they can't get ahead. So there are these sort of tones of societal sort of inequality, I would say, in the movie, more because it really does sort of paint a bad picture of education, and it does seem completely pointless for anyone who's trying to sort of get ahead, at least in the way it's
and that's probably like one of the interesting parts as well. Just the golden tickets, right? Because we're talking about millions of kids, right, and stuff, and then there's 5 kids like kind of that are able to kind of, so maybe in some ways that like Charlie was destined to kind of get that ticket, at least from the perspective of the story and stuff. But it's an interesting point though that like if you have those kind of odds against you, right, and stuff, it's kind of like it's pretty bleak I don't know, portrayal of like kind of what it takes to kind of make it in the world, like kind of, if like, there's only a handful of opportunities and and then for that matter, like kind of the 4 of the other kids, right, are given that because basically, they're more or less like kind of, everything's kind of given to them,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so it's kind of funny how maybe the message is that like, if you work hard enough and kind of have a good heart, and in the end you'll make it and stuff like that. But at the same time, what's it also saying is that like the odds are really against you.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it's quite an effective story in that respect. It sets you up for the massive inequality in most adult life, I would say.
Right.
And I think it also kind of serves as a way of sort of parable for lottery winners in a way, in that it's kind of, the chocolate factory I kind of see as it represents, all of these sort of unrealized dreams of what someone would do if they could have as much of anything they want in the world, but from a kid's perspective. And, you kind of see most of the characters crashing and burning when they're given this grand opportunity.
Right.
And you see they're saying this sort of lottery winners, they'll often, there's like only a small percentage that kind of manage to kind of hold everything together. And so, I think there's sort of shades of that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point though too. That like they said something about I want to say like the like 4 out of 5 lottery winners like end up not only like kind of throwing away the money but basically ending up broke and stuff. It's pretty staggering. The like so what I'm saying is that like also that this idea that like we had this notion that once you win the lottery you're set for life. But the reality is that like a lot of them end up, just end up broke. So that's, and it's funny how the odds are actually 4 out of 5 kind of, so that's a weird connection to, this, the original and stuff.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you have sort of family members and people that that you've probably gotten really well, all kind of turning on you. And it's probably a very surreal experience, not unlike entering Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, I would say.
Right.
But that is also kind of summed up by there's a line right at the end of G Marder where it says, hey, did you hear the story about the kid who got everything he ever wanted? And he goes, no. And he goes, oh, he lived happily ever after, which kind of seems like it's not a very interesting story, really, because that's probably not the truth most of the time. But and interesting, but maybe that's I think in terms of a reflection of times, that may be a good segue to move into the Tim Burton version, right? Because there's a lot of interesting changes in that movie.
So here we have a updated one, of course, and complete with CGI and Tim Burton kind of touch and everything, and for that matter, Danny Elfman now doing the soundtrack. So I feel like the one thing that you and I have talked about before is how like I personally felt like really missing the music like of the original. Yeah,
I mean, in some respect, well, in a lot of respects actually, the Tim Burton one is much closer to the book. The songs that the Oompa Loompas sing are exactly the words that are in the ends of each chapter.
Oh wow!
Of those sections of the book, and they even scan the same way. It's very helpful though. If you are reading the book, this is a good top tip for any parents that are watching. You can steal some of Danny Elfman's scanning and songs when you're reading the book, because it's quite hard to get through those songs. So I was just basically copying the tunes from Tim Burton's version. But I mean, they portray, he does some sort of interesting artistic touches, but it does kind of follow along the level of poverty that Charlie's and his family's in. His dad is there, and he works in the toothpaste factory, which is an interesting kind of. Of course, now what they do is they make it a kind of a comment on automation, because he has this completely useless job in the book of screwing on the caps of toothpaste bottles, and in this he's replaced by a machine because it's so successful, which I thought was an interesting idea. So, he's already kind of touched on automation and outsourcing of jobs to robots, which was interesting.
Well, they also kind of twisted it even further though, where like he ends up making more money because he repairs the machine that replaces his job. I thought that was an interesting twist.
Well, this is, yeah. I mean, this is this sort of thing where it's this whole kind of circular cycle of technology that I think I look back on how sort of Stanley Kubrick looked at 2001, this cynicism towards it. And this is, again, you know, Tim Burton's obviously pretty cynical about technology, and it may be why a lot of his movies rely on, say, Planet of the Apes prosthetic effects, or you know, visual artwork and stop frame animation and all this kind of stuff. Because yeah, there's obviously a cynicism there. But yeah, I mean, this idea that, you know, he makes more money as repairing the robots. I mean, automation is one of the fields in business that business leaders can sort of latch onto and say, okay, we can clearly see that investing our money into that is going to lead to better results, because we can get rid of a few people from the department. Whereas things like AI maybe not so obvious to a lot of established companies. Data warehousing as well. You have to invest so much in pooling all your data and cleaning it all up, and then hiring data scientists. So automation is quite a popular thing for a lot of corporations to invest in, but because you've got to retrain so many people, you end up with like 3 times as many people trying to learn how to do this automation that you could have just done with a person. You know, I see the same kind of things happening. So it's just an interesting thing. But again, a lot of these things are hyped up for, these technologies are hyped up for companies at the moment. So yeah, interesting to see that back in this movie. But that was a major sort of sidetracking there for me. But so yeah, let me see. I was going to say another update in terms of technology is Mike TV.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because before he was just watching TV, now he's like a video gamer, you know. And rather than him being the passive, and I think this is a reflection of video games versus television, because rather than being the passive kid who's watching TV, he's now become the kid who's figuring out how to sort of like work the system and beat the games, and he's the one who figures out how to find the Wonka bar with the golden ticket.
Oh, right.
Which is not unlike some of the ridiculous reflexes that some kids who are really, really good at video games. I feel there's like a same level of superhuman ability when I see some of them playing video games. So that was an interesting twist on that character, I thought.
I think overall, though, like it's, you know, what we find with the other characters, other than, you know, Charlie and, you know, of course, Willy Wonka and stuff, is that everyone kind of blurs into the background. You know, like, I mean, I feel like that's the kind of the main thing. And then for that matter, I have to kind of really point it out, though, that like, you know, we'll talk more about Johnny Depp and everything, but Freddie Highmore, this is apparently one of his early, you know, kind of big roles and stuff. And if we get to it, we're going to talk about how he ends up being Norman Bates in the reboot series of, you know, Bates Motel, stuff like that. And it's really bizarre to see him in this context, because, you know, that's what I know him from. And I, you know, had no idea he was in this movie before watching it.
Yeah. Was I not wrong in that there is a reference to Psycho in Willy Wonka?
Oh, really?
Is there not? There was something where I'm sure there was the shower scene was shown in some context. I don't know if it was something that Mike TV was watching, or there's definitely a scene that. Oh well, no. Sorry, maybe I'm wrong. That in 2001 is referenced.
Yes, definitely, yeah.
You know, in the Mike TV
Clearly.
section, because then I thought that was so brilliant. You know, that he replaces the monolith in 2001 with the Wonka chocolate bar. That was that was actually a really nice touch. But yeah, I'm sure I spotted it, and it was after you mentioned it before we watched it, and I just because I had it on my mind. I'm sure there was a scene in there. But I almost want to watch it again now just to see that. But yeah, it's a weird connection. Speaking of psychopaths and their tendencies, of course, we're now Violet Beauregard is not only just a kind of a slightly compulsive character, but now she's like an obsessive, competitive winner as well, who's been kind of brainwashed by her mother in this one. Which is a very kind of interesting statement on how parents can sort of like push their kids in, you know, to be, you know, real winners over competitiveness. So that was another interesting modern take on her character, I thought.
That's true. That definitely portrayed a lot more like kind of the children's pageants, which seems like, yeah, I think after the 70s that became a lot bigger of a thing where, like kind of the Honey Boo Boo and all that kind of stuff. Like that's a more recent kind of thing that's kind of happened and stuff. We didn't have, you had kids in pageants, but I think it wasn't nearly the same kind of, kind of cutthroat competitiveness that like, in some ways that's really what's portrayed with Violet.
Yeah, and I think I would say that maybe the difference between this and the 70s version in the way the parents' failings or the children, I almost feel like the kids have been denied like a proper free childhood in the remake. You kind of get the feeling that in a way Mike TV has been denied a sort of a realistic outlook on life by simply sitting in front of a video game console the whole time. Likewise, Violet Beauregard has been so pushed by her parents. So almost the opposite, and the neglect of Mike TV has pushed him down one avenue, and too much sort of pushing by the parents has made Violet Beauregard kind of like miss out on a lot of stuff. And I guess sort of Veruca Salt is just spoilt. There's no real change there. But yeah, and I suppose Augustus Gloop isn't really changed that much. But those two are the ones that I really kind of see is there's a very different kind of slant on how the parents treat them in the remake. So yeah, I mean it's definitely, and I think all of these, of course, we've got the new edition of. We get to see Willy Wonka's childhood in this,
right?
Like which is for me was a really weird twist on this, because in many respects the remake is very faithful to the book. It follows a lot of the same plot points. There's no big kind of twist with Slugworth or them, getting betrayed. It's just literally who makes it through the end, which is very much like the book. But yeah, you get this whole backstory for Willy Wonka when he's having his flashbacks, and there's a very heavy-handed message that goes almost directly in the opposite direction of Roald Dahl's original intention, which is this idea that if you deny your child any sweets or particular experiences, then they will rebel against this later on in life and go in completely the opposite direction, which is kind of, I think there's definitely some truth in that. But I would say, in a way, Willy Wonka's dentist dad is pretty hard on him. And I love this idea that he says, if you go and eat some sweets, well, by the time you get back, I won't be here. And not only he's gone, but the entire house has been removed. It's just it's just such a hilariously bleak thing for to be completely abandoned by his parent. I mean, it's quite comic in a way. I kind of enjoyed it more than I thought I would. But yeah.
And I felt like, that was almost like a metaphor for Tim Burton and Disney. I don't know if you know his story, but I felt like that was like kind of either a jab or, because the bottom line with his relationship was that like, he kind of knew that he was a black sheep kind of freak and stuff like that in a lot of ways, but I guess for some reason he thought that like maybe he'd be embraced by Disney because of his talent and everything, and quite the opposite happened, of course, where like kind of they were looking at him like like him, he had basically had three heads, and like kind of basically like a Tim Burton character, and ultimately though come around and stuff like that like after he kind of achieved his own success on his terms, then he kind of got pulled back into the fold and stuff like that. So I feel like that's really what we're seeing in kind of the relationship with Christopher Lee as the dentist dad and Willy Wonka and stuff. It's just really, I mean, I don't know, like maybe Tim Burton probably would say like, oh, like kind of, haha, kind of that's ridiculous, stuff like that. But, to me, like, it's like kind of like, I mean, it couldn't be any more straightforward, I guess, in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I was aware. I knew he had some, because it's very obvious when you look through Disney Plus movies, and you see The Nightmare Before Christmas is kind of like there's like the one it stands out quite obviously from all the other stuff that's there. Yeah, and that's a very interesting take. Actually, it'd be I wouldn't be surprised if there's some element of that.
And that's a statement itself of like kind of different times how parents have their wishes for kids, and different times like kids are still individuals. So it's like, I mean, that's really symbolizes that universal tension that on the one hand like we do want to kind of be good example for our kids and stuff, but the other, they're also ultimately their own beings as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's good that he introduces more of that complexity into the remake. I would say it's not quite such a simple and traditional story in that respect in terms of parenting as the original. Yeah, and I mean, I think, but in a way, it's weird in that it's very faithful, except for this backstory of Willy Wonka, which was an odd thing, but also it's kind of like it loses out because it doesn't have that re-engineering of the songs, and the songs really don't work very well in it. And I mean, they are exactly what's in the book, but they just don't. They're too long, and you can't really hear the words clearly because they're trying to keep everything scanning, and they're trying to get a different music thematic kind of feeling for each of the songs. And
I feel like it's again the kind of MTV effect in a bad way though, because it's like like kind of has that edgier kind of rock kind of thing to it and stuff. And Deep Roy is kind of funny and entertaining in a kind of quirky way. But that's really all it is though, like where it's quirky, but it doesn't really resonate if like it. No. And I feel like we just really, as we talked about before, it just you long for like kind of the classic Willy Wonka songs.
Yeah, because there's no other songs in it. It's just the songs that the Oompa Loompas do, and that's about it, really. Yeah. So I guess then we've done everything else. We might as well face up to, because we're on a theme of ape-related movies recently, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is Johnny Depp's portrayal of Willy Wonka.
Right.
So yeah, I would say actually, the first time I watched this movie, I was a big fan of the original, and I'd actually forgotten what the original book was like, and only really thought of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as the Gene Wilder movie. So I saw the remake the first time, and I thought, what is this aberration in front of me, this horrific mess? But actually, after reading the book and seeing it directly afterwards, I actually this was actually quite enjoyable. I actually quite enjoyed the remake. It was not as bad as I thought, although I think for me, the one thing that really annoyed me was like this kind of obvious kind of slapstick humor of him walking into the great glass elevator. And I mean, it's kind of funny, I suppose, as an idea, but it doesn't, it's really poorly executed. It's after watching the Pink Panther and some real masters of slapstick comedy, it feels very kind of tired and kind of done it again. And I kind of I think I missed the subtlety of Gene Wilder's indifference towards the children. Right. In this one, he's kind of he's a bit more kind of abrasive, I would say, to the kids. I don't know why he keeps sort of saying scoot to them all the time. There's a weird thing for him to kind of build into that kind of character. It's kind of like he doesn't really like children, but he's I mean, at least you felt like Gene Wilder wasn't completely kind of like uninterested in the children in this one, because he couldn't be. I mean, and that's what I think clashed for me as the character, because the whole reason Willy Wonka gets the kids along is because he can't trust adults to run his factory for him. And so there's a part of Willy Wonka that's very much like a child, and that's a child that's never grown up, the Michael Jackson kind of thing, that people kind of, the parallel that they make in that. But he likes, in the book, he likes kids, and he actually enjoys spending time with nice kids, I mean, the Great Glass Elevator, he's saying, oh, what a great kid you are, Charlie, you're really working with me together and we'll solve this thing. So you don't get any of that from Johnny Depp's character. You kind of get this idea that he really doesn't like children, which is kind of funny in a way. But it's funny in a kind of from the perspective of an idea, but it really doesn't make you emotionally resonate with that character at all. Like you come away thinking, well, he was kind of quirky and he made a few funny bits here and there, but I didn't really like him at all as a character. Whereas Gene Wilder, even though he's completely nuts, you're drawn in by his charisma, and you feel that he actually being genuinely nice towards Charlie and his family at the end. So
yeah, I feel like the Johnny Depp version is almost like a creepy version of Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson, for all the different things you may think about him and stuff like that, he was a kind of a gentle soul and stuff like that, and I feel like that's what Gene Wilder kind of brought to the character, and that you saw this gentleness, like kind of it's not like simply like kind of like, oh, I kind of this thing with kids and everything like that, this kind of push pull tension, but meanwhile, though, with Johnny Depp, though, you just feel like there's this kind of creepiness. Like is all that kind of is left of, the Michael Jackson kind of connection.
Yeah, and I didn't really. I think that's I wasn't totally sort of against that. I think it was quite an interesting sort of take. I think for me though is the fact that at some point I was hoping that I would actually kind of emotionally kind of feel like he was, there was something likable about this character that I wanted to. You kind of feel sorry for him because you get this whole backstory. So there's definitely a kind of a very much, it's more rather than actually being drawn in by the natural, this inventive kind of charismatic, eccentric character, which is how the book portrays him. You're kind of like, well, this is a very kind of isolated, aloof, again, eccentric character, but one who's completely detached from most human interactions and doesn't really have, he doesn't really know how to deal with the real world is the kind of more the message I would say of the remake.
And that's probably like a weird kind of connection between the two, though, is this idea that like you have to almost be like kind of a hermit to be a creative genius. Like in other words, that's the kind of the underlying like theme or message and stuff like that genius kind of operates on its own. When in reality, of course, we know that like there's a lot of collaboration that happens with the real inventors and the real kind of creators that's out there, whether on YouTube, of course, or whatever. But and I feel like kind of sometimes some of my best ideas have been just simply when we're kind of talking about things and then we're bouncing things off of each other and stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually I think there is definitely this kind of journey that celebrities and creative people go on in terms of their career, where you see them probably, like, let's take the Beatles, for example. There you've got like an incredibly tight-knit collaborative unit that then basically various sort of egos get out of, I would say, in my perspective, they get out of control and they all go their separate ways. And I would say, you can argue, John Lennon certainly wrote some good songs afterwards, but I don't think Paul McCartney ever wrote as good as songs after the Beatles as he did in the Beatles. And I would say, apart from a couple of, I would say, John Lennon wrote an awful lot of his, I would say the majority of his good stuff in the Beatles, really, even though he wrote some good songs afterwards. But you know what I mean? It's like there's this thing of the collaboration is where the good stuff happens, but the ego takes over and it thinks, if I was just that hermit, if I just had some time to myself and I get rid of all these other assholes and I can just do my thing, I'm going to be so much better. And the result is just never the same. And you can see that with George Lucas as well, Star Wars original trilogy and the prequels, same thing happening there.
Yeah, I mean, his wife was such a key part about it that, like, we really don't hear about it. But she was really responsible for the editing for the original movie. I mean, you in our minds, like, kind of, until knowing that, was like, oh, it's all George Lucas stuff and everything. But she was a key part about, like, how, like, kind of, like, just the way that's what we know as the final product was put together and everything. Because for that matter, too, like, from what I've heard as well, through reading, was that, like, just the first cuts that, he made more personally, his friends, friends as Coppola and, so on, like, kind of basically kind of like really like, like, were pretty much like that's what you've done, like after all this time and stuff. And so it's funny how, like, you know, that we don't hear about the influence that his wife had on, you know, the original and stuff.
Totally. And I think collaboration is, and you can almost sort of take this a little deeper, and we're getting way off the thing here of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but I really feel like creative collaboration is really the key to sort of successful creative projects.
Yeah.
You can almost see this geared in the way of our society getting more and more individualistic, and we're becoming more and more isolated, which is probably no surprise that our movies are generally getting worse, I would say, over time, with a few exceptions here and there, and music and everything else. It's because a lot of that great music and great movies were made in a much more collaborative space, I think, with the creative people perhaps having more control than they do now, you know, rather than business decisions driving this. So it may just be a product of culture, but I think it's definitely that's the thing.
I feel like we're going to definitely talk more about that with the Star Wars, you know, like, because of the fact that, like, you have the shift not only to kind of beyond collaboration, though, it can get to the point, though, of, you know, design by committee, which is a whole other discussion.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, one interesting sort of, for our few viewers that are out there, in terms of a background scene of how we make these videos, one thing that I always find surprising, and this is sort of a testament to collaborative work, is that both me and John will write our notes separately before the show. Right. And so a good portion of the show is of us just sort of making the points that we've noticed during the movies. But I would say there's a good portion of these chats where a lot of stuff just comes up just from us talking about it, that is actually quite surprising for both of us. I know for myself anyway, there's always things that just as a product of the conversation come up that we hadn't previously thought of, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, for me personally, different times, like something that you'll say in a moment and it'll trigger this connection I didn't make while I was watching the movie and stuff. Yeah. And then, you know, so then, you know, then because of that, I'm able to kind of like, oh yeah, you know, like connect the dots that like just weren't there before our conversation. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's always very interesting that happens very regularly as well. It's a real testament to that collaborative effort. But anyway, I guess getting back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, then I guess, so we've done Johnny Depp. We've done, I would say one thing I did like, though, on this one is that the budget was quite small for the original 70s one. I think it was like 3 or 4 million. And I'm guessing Tim Burton's budget was significantly higher. Yeah. And I mean, just the you know, stuff like the fact that he was accurately recreating the boat exactly as it was in the book was pretty cool. The fact that the chocolate river and all the landscape was very much more kind of elaborate and more visually kind of interesting. I actually did. I kind of got a kick out of that. I thought the visual element, Tim Burton, as usual, didn't really disappoint in that respect for me at all. Definitely. Yeah, we'll definitely see, you know, like kind of more of, you know, his work in future discussions and stuff. You know, because we, of course, have talked about him with Planet of the Apes, but he's definitely, you know, like influential in a lot of different ways and a lot of different things that he's done. I think the one other thing I think we didn't really talk about was the grandfather. And I feel like, you know, Jack Albertson was just much more effective. You know, we talked before about casting choices and stuff. And, you know, he's kind of like that's his thing, I guess, so to speak, you know, like kind of, because he ends up being Chico and the Man and stuff in the television series in the 70s and stuff. And that was, a huge, like, kind of, you know, success for him. And I feel like, you know, kind of in this one, you know, like, yeah, the grandfather was capable, but it just was not nearly as memorable performance and stuff. Yeah, he didn't get as many lines, really. And there wasn't as much. There's a much more focus on Charlie and his grandfather in each situation. Right. And like, if you'll notice that Charlie reacts to one of the kids, and then his grandfather will kind of like, sort of like bounce off that and tell him what's actually happening or what he thinks of the kid in those things. So there's a much sort of tighter bond between the two characters. You didn't get so much of that in the remake at all.
Charlie, though, was more front and center, I would say, which is more in keeping with Roald Dahl's intention, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that it's as good. It's one of those things. This is the problem with the remake. In many respects, it's much closer to the book, but it's not as good a movie. You know, the 70s movie changes a lot of stuff. It plays around with things, but ultimately, it is a better movie. It has better songs. It's just all round much better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was pretty much pretty clear from the beginning of our discussion and stuff like that, that we were biased and everything. And I feel like that's the thing that, your typical remake struggles against, is that like when you have such a strong original, you're fighting an uphill battle to kind of with people's expectations. And I think, like in this case, Danny Elfman is no slouch either. Like, in other words, they didn't hire just some amateur musician. This is somebody who has done like amazing things for, like Tim Burton, like we've talked about collaboration. I mean, that's a great collaboration over the years of many different projects. But here we really just don't see it, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then going back to the whole thing about collaboration, this is probably one of the successes that Tim Burton's realized, because he often works with the same actors and some of the others, I'm guessing some of the same production crew as well. You build that relationship, and it helps definitely down the road. You could say the same with Akira Kurosawa. You often work with the same actors. It clearly comes through. But yeah, I was going to mention someone else, but I've forgotten who it was now. There was another good example of a collaborative director. I suppose John Carpenter. He used a lot of the same people.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. And we'll see that actually with Bong Joon-ho. And I guess, that's something we'll briefly mention. I guess we haven't really talked about it, though, that Snowpiercer has this weird, funny connection that we'll be exploring in a future episode and stuff. We'll just briefly mention that, like, there's a couple of videos, we'll link those as well. And it's something that, like, it's just something that, like, is quirky, but yet the more we've, kind of watched these, excuse me, the original Willy Wonka, and it starts to kind of, you really start seeing the dots that weren't there before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't wait for that.
And coming up in some future episode, we'll go ahead and revisit the Planet of the Apes with the more modern take and stuff like that. And then, as Dave and I've joked offline, we've gone full deep ape with more, of the series there with King Kong, and then also Mighty Joe Young in another future episode. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the movies.